to welcome you to the second panel of the day, Public Space Global Media. Now, I consider the greatest virtues of a moderator brevity and the ability to pronounce everyone's name correctly, so I'll try and do both in quick time. The papers on this panel address directly the intersection between the communicator schema of public space and the communicator schema of globalized media embedded into these spaces. So we're going to hear about Al Jazeera cameras perched high over Tahrir Square. We're going to hear about offline societies and their productive relation with social media communication. We're going to hear about television, terrestrial television, vis-a-vis both new media and the oldest media of public space. What we'd like to do here is have exactly 20 minutes for each speaker, and then ask questions of the panel as a whole in the final 30. So, recalling my promise of brevity, let me introduce our first speaker. Professor William Humans is Assistant Professor of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. He has a PhD in Communications from Michigan Ann Arbor, and his research interests include global news media, including social movements, international broadcasting, in the context of the Arab world, including Arab media law and Al Jazeera. It is from this research nexus that he brings us today's talk, Al Jazeera's hidden Tahrir camera, the mediatization of a revolutionary public space.
Thank you for the introduction, and to Monroe and Breyer for organizing this. I'm very honored to be here. One of the iconic shots of Tahrir Square during the 2011 Egyptian uprising, on television that is, was Al Jazeera's live overhead feed of the encampment. It was really low in production value, grainy, yet proved to be a revolutionary asset. It was stationary, capturing the encampment all day, every day. Its low resolution suggests that it was, at least for some time, shot through a laptop camera or a commercial-grade camera, and its signal was further faded by the fact that it was connected through through satellite. It survived the regime's internet closure as a result, but it also survived the arrests, detentions, and property confiscations of Al Jazeera journalists because it was planted previously and set up to communicate with satellite, circumventing the state's technical controls, as well as multiple efforts to locate and remove the camera by regime henchmen who might not have known exactly what they were looking for as they went from apartment to apartment and tried to figure out where this device was. While this shot resembled the angle and aesthetics of closed-circuit cameras that record public spaces in the name of security and crime enforcement purposes, most famously in cities such as London, this shot was broadcast for the world to see. It was a very different kind of surveillance, which is by definition from the top down. It was hardly bottom-up surveillance, a subversion of watching often applied to the use of mobile phones and small recording devices that capture and publicize the crimes of those in power and their agents. An example of surveillance in Egypt, for example, would be YouTube videos that were posted of police beatings. So this shot was a mode of surveillance in solidarity with the protests, with people power. It was a shot, however, broadcast via a network funded by Qatar, which should be noted because it suggests a necessary element of international relations to the story of Mubarak's overthrow. This camera, many felt, was important on the ground for having something of a deterrence effect. It limited the regime's range of options, especially because it brought about interventions by foreign powers, namely the United States, alarmed by the images of repression coming from the country. Again, the international relations dimension does matter, but this is not said to diminish the agency, the endogeneity of Mubarak's downfall, which was ultimately the product of Egyptian initiative and action by liberating Liberation Square. Tahrir Square long reflected the state of national politics in Egypt. Just to give you some background, it was until the 1950s occupied by a British military base. Egypt's secondary sovereignty was the outcome of a history of direct and indirect British rule, and the use of the space certainly reflected that. The base, however, went unused for its final 8 years, roughly overlapping with the ambiguous period of decolonization in the region after World War II. And then with the rise of Gamal Abdel Nasser and Egypt's break with the British through the nationalization of the Suez Canal in 1956, Tahrir soon came to be a show of pan-Arab and socialist leanings in Egypt's under Nasser. government buildings came up. These government buildings were largely set up by Soviet architects, reflecting the architecture of the USSR. But also lining Tahrir Square was the Arab League headquarters, embodying both of Nasser's political faces. By the 2000s, Tahrir came to be marked by both dilapidation and neoliberalism, the simultaneous trends of Egypt's modern political economy. The heart of the corrupt and ineffectual bureaucracy was in one of those Soviet-style buildings. Above Tahrir Square were pock-marked billboards advertising global brands. This was the unfulfilled promise of globalization that the regime had paraded as being the answer to Egypt's woes. At the ground level, however, visitors, often tourists, but also members of the elite, could visit KFC and Pizza Hut franchises. As Andrew Beatty noted in 2006, in writing in 2006, he said that Tahrir Square was impressive for its size rather than its aesthetic qualities. It is more of a space than a square, an ugly gap in the urban landscape surrounded by a mishmash of buildings of utterly different heights and styles. All in all, it is easy to feel disappointed with the place. A world city such as Cairo deserves better than this at its urban heart. It was physically central, but became less so socially over time. Important, though, it was a wide space, more so than a concrete square or pure roundabout, giving it the impressive spatial openness that made it a natural terrain for public protests. Still, most protests saw police and government agents outnumbering demonstrators, especially during the years of the Kafaya movement, known as one of the early sort of online protest movements in Egypt. One description of the massive 2003 protests that were around the war in Iraq in February 2011, in 2003 could sound like actually a report from 2011. The previous weekend, Cairo had witnessed 2 days of protests like nothing seen since the 1970s, complete with a day-long occupation of the central Tahrir Square on Thursday and running battles between riot police and demonstrators trying to reach the square again on Friday. So Tahrir Square had a long history of being a site for protests. Subsequent reform movements also tried to gather there, making its centrality in 2011 hardly surprising. My emphasis, however, is on the mediation of this public square. There can be no doubt that the goal of activists was to capture the space and to hold the physical space. Now, this is from a manual that was being circulated among activists in the first week of protests in the January 25th movement. These were directions on how to grab space. On this page, under the strategic goals of civil disobedience, it listed as the first goal, to take over important government buildings, which the manual said would win over sympathetic policymakers, the army's ranks, and the public. It would, the manual suggested, probably a bit overconfidently, that this would give the protesters leverage to protect them and their comrades from the regime. Now, on the last page of this manual, and important to this kind of debate about the role of social media, the manual says explicitly to stay off Facebook and to stay off Twitter because these are monitored by the Ministry of the Interior. In fact, the protesters, and this is a side story, or actually a key story about this that relates to this question of social media, the protesters who originally captured Tahrir Square briefly in January 25th did so by planning 20 protests on Facebook, knowing that the regime would mobilize to stop those protests, while organizing a secret 21st protest offline. And the small group gathered at a pre-planned location and basically grabbed people from cafes and led them to capture Tahrir. And then all the rest of the groups tried to descend on Tahrir. So the story of grabbing this public space is remarkably offline. Now, the mass taking of this public space allowed for a display of numbers towards a shared sense of outrage, an expression that no state can ignore. It directly challenges the legitimacy of the state, creating an exception to its territoriality, to its monopoly on the use of force, to call on Weber's definition. This may only be implied in a reform movement, or more direct with a revolutionary one, but powers such as Egypt's would not see the difference. In such a space of protest, advocates of an alternative political order can build the political imaginary they propound. In Tahrir, that meant creating a new republic, a mini-city characterized by volunteerism and a new normative order. The protesters' practices of cleaning the square, which they organized in small units, really was a revolutionary act in a city famed for its pollution and litter. Volunteers put together makeshift hospitals, garbage collection, kindergartens. This is pretty well documented. So then, we know that physical space, capturing the physical space, was the heart of the story. So what is the proper role for mediation? That is the kind of question that I want to ask. If activists capture a public space, but there's no media to report it, to spread it wide, what happens? And you can insert the tree in the forest cliche here. Perhaps in older times, mass crowds could use brute force and withstand casualties to force the downfalls of monarchies. But with modern technologies and the tactics of state coercion, it seems like an unlikely outcome in modern times. It's hard to see the regime placing limits on its own use of force without some outward communication, without the presence of foreign surveillance, media reporting, and the international pressure that it brings to bear on the regime and the regime's institutions, such as the military. So admittedly, extracting the role of media from the liberatory redefinition of public space away from the regime's control may be impossible, particularly if you were to take an ecological approach. After all, how can we make sense of pulling apart media and politics of social media, for example, when we can see these images of activists in Tahrir hunched over their laptops, circulating information outwardly, images, video, while watching Al Jazeera as its closest laptop to us shows, finding out what's going elsewhere in the city and elsewhere in the country. So there's a circular relationship that makes unpacking very difficult. Or what do we make of the projection of Al Jazeera and Al Jazeera's channel Mubashir on large screens in Tahrir, something that Al Jazeera English, to add to the circularity, reported about. The image in the middle is one of those screens with a projected image of Al Jazeera. So it's this very strange circularity that makes unpacking even more difficult. But what drives me to tell the story then? This is what drives me, the circularity, to tell the story of one particular shot that I think offers something of a break in that circularity. I think it stands for the role of one medium, TV, and one news network, Al Jazeera, as abetting and enabling this public space capture to take, to kind of fulfill itself. The mediation of this particular locale, which survived all other efforts to create as much as an information blackout as possible, destroyed the regime's best shot as a total counter-mobilization against protesters. As we know, regimes have tremendous power and can effectively defeat popular movements. They do this all the time. A micro-history of a mediation of a public space can tell us how one particular media-politics of space moment mattered then. So I want to go over the story of the shot. Al Jazeera's coverage fixated on the actions of the protesters. In the early days of the January 25th movement, right as it became clear that this was not going to be a typical sort of Egyptian flash protest, as so many of them were previously, Al Jazeera English's award-winning correspondent, Ayman Mohleddin, rushed to get a vantage point for a camera to capture what was taking place in Tahrir in the early days. Mohyeldin, by the way, now at NBC News, is an Arab American of Egyptian and Palestinian ancestry. I mention this biographical information only to point out that his familiarity with the place and the people there gave Al Jazeera English a huge reporting advantage. This sort of personal and cultural proximity and the resources, as well as the resources the channel invested, made it a go-to source for outsiders. I think Mohyeldin's personal relationship, also being the correspondent in Cairo, is one reason for his exceptional reporting, not to mention that of Shireen Todros, Rawia Raga, and all the other journalists who were there. But Mohyeldin's access to the circles, to the networks of protests really helped out, and I think are part of the story behind the shot. So on or around January 27, 2011, Mohyeldin rushed from his apartment in Zamalek. He wanted to capture the action in Tahrir to find a spot that would be good for live feeds, as his profile in GQ describes what he did. After a number of failed attempts to persuade people to open their well-perched patios to an Al Jazeera crew, the paranoia about reprisals was still rife. He tried an 8-story apartment building, talked his way past the doorman. Again, having the relationship and the access to the place helps. He caught the rickety elevator to the top floor. There, a door drew back to reveal a disheveled man, pot-bellied, wild-haired, wearing a Che t-shirt that said revolution, perfect kind of ally. Behind the man lay a huge cluttered apartment. "Who the hell are you?" he said. Mohyeldin asked, "Do you want to make television history?" With the internet cut off, Al Jazeera's reporters and producers, as well as Associated Citizen journalists, could no longer easily get the images out that the world wanted to see, except for this particular camera, because of its began access to satellite. The shot, and this shows what this device sort of looks like, a closed-up laptop. The shot survived the regime's information closure because it utilized this satellite technology. As the image shows, a device this size can send signals to one of 3 geostationary satellites. The terminal accesses broadband internet, which is one reason why the image was always sort of degraded. The mobility of these devices makes them useful for armies, reporters, and protesters, but their cost usually puts them out of reach for protesters. The shot survived regime efforts to track down the device. The shot had the important effect of prioritizing the space of dissent over the many other spaces of non-articulated dissent throughout the city in Al Jazeera English's coverage. We saw this battle of images play out in what state TV, pictured on the right, showed at the time, while Al Jazeera English displayed its hidden shot at a key moment of growing world attention to Egypt. This juxtaposition was highlighted by Al Jazeera English as if to brag about its power in the face of Egyptian state power. So on many occasions it showed zoomed up protests in Tahrir next to this sort of state TV depicting the many quiet places in Cairo. This was a direct affront to the state's media power. The narrative of Tahrir's capture was amplified through close-up, while state media showed a quiet city through a wide zoom of non-liberated zones, as to say what's going on in Tahrir is just an angry minority. Now eventually, these polar narratives started to converge a bit, and state TV was forced to report what was happening on Al Jazeera, because Al Jazeera's reporting was what was circulating international. So you can start to see here that state TV is showing the same sort of explosion that's shown by close-up by Al Jazeera English's camera. And this media space closing in was represented by the permanence, or kind of correlated with the permanence of the encampment in the physical space and the national and international attention it received. So while the collective action efforts behind the mobilization to capture the space and transform it into a truly public space are key, they were empowered by a media presence and subsequent exposure that brought the world support. It instituted an informal layer of global scrutiny on the regime through the mechanisms of international relations. After a video of the Egyptian Baltageya, or thugs or henchmen, assault on the protesters spread, international condemnation quickly followed. The U.S. intervened more publicly as the protest staying power was made apparent. So I do kind of focus on the role of the U.S. because as an external power, a key source of aid for Egypt, they had great leverage over the military, which ended up being the crucial central institution behind the elite split, giving way to Mubarak's fall. So the U.S. spokesman had also issued warnings when Egypt detained Al Jazeera's journalists, putting into central focus the power of media to abet the cause of those on the ground. So I can't claim to fully know what was happening behind closed doors. Does that say 5 minutes?
It does.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I'm not wearing my glasses, so. Should totally use a marker. From the outside then, but in the public realm, this surveillance shot likely mattered. If it did not directly deter the regime itself, it further gave the outside world a point from which to witness and speak against the regime. Foreign powers had to take position thanks to the global circulation of news and information. In the United States, in which the public is notoriously not attuned to international affairs, some polls showed that up to 50% of Americans were following the story. So even access to the story was ultimately politicized. Outside powers and publics opposed the regime's efforts to silence the people, to close down the internet, and the arrests of journalists. Al Jazeera became famous in the United States as reports circulated that people in the State Department were watching it, and Barack Obama. So this short shot and this role of Al Jazeera gave entree point for international relations to sort of materialize and put further pressure on the regime and constrain its actions. The shot was essential, especially after the 3 days in January 2011, when the internet was shut down and when regime's backers' assaults targeted media. You know, there were other technologies that were important. I shouldn't discount those, and those actually stayed continuously open. International telephone lines and satellite phones, for example, but they lacked that key element of visuality. They were unable to induce a sort of emotionality, and they were less persuasive ultimately, as were the images. When the internet came back online and the information blockade approach was shown to have failed, the regime continued to target journalists, but Tahrir was largely open access again. The mediation of Tahrir continued then without interruption. I cannot say with certainty that this shot was the string that prevented even more massacre, a full military onslaught to clear Tahrir, but I do know it was important for the circulation of live images for the outside watching in, both outside of the country but also for other Egyptians. For Diane, TV, and this is about the question of, well, what's the role of TV as this source for public space or to amplify public space capture from social movements. For Diane, TV is still the source of monstration or the force of presentation, of displaying what is important in the world centrally and with authority for wide public consumption. I think I agree with that. Diane argues that social media can offer pre-monstration, supplying some signal and a lot of noise suggesting what TV should be covering, but without the mass reach of TV. Social media can remonstrate or highlight what was on TV, recirculate and amplify it. But TV, as Patty Scannell has noted, is the medium of the center. Of course, we cannot say that Al Jazeera English or TV or Qatar, Al Jazeera's sponsor, overthrew Mubarak. The capture of Tahrir did. It caused the realignment of domestic power institutions and the split in the elite. It split the military and Mubarak. But TV let the outside world exacerbate this. With the Egypt story, Al Jazeera was the central source of monstration and the central medium. If its surveillance of Tahrir Square acted as a check on the state's response by bringing the threat of international opprobrium, then we cannot discuss the subversive politics of protest that capture public space in isolation from mediation. Whether that media represents the troubling and confounding potential for exogenous power in national revolutions is something, of course, we also have to consider. And as we see in Egypt today, Tahrir Square still is a central space in the sort of post-revolutionary factionalism and the continued internal strife. But I just wanted with this presentation to show you why mediation of public space beyond the actual capture of public space mattered in this particular moment. Thank you.
And there was a brilliant talk, and exactly on time. So, our next talk is by Professor Mona El-Khatif. She's the Associate Professor of Architecture and Urban Design at the California College of Art, and also has a professional degree in architecture from RWTH in Aachen. Her research includes subjects of urban regeneration, place moderation, urban ecologies. She has a 2009 book called State Urbanism, and the title of today's talk actually comes a little bit from that. Staged Urbanism, Social Networking as an all-word tool for the reinvention of the contemporary agora.
Thank you for the invitation, and I'm actually very, very fascinated by all the presentations today. And before I start, I just want to locate my talk a little bit. So being an urbanist and designer, to come back to the keynote, it was really, really clear as a manifest on how important the physical space is, and the mentioning of the regime of property, law, and norms. I also truly believe as a designer that we should not only think about the limits of public spaces, but also about the potentials, and that actually design can be very in support of this, specifically when we think about the negotiation between top-down and bottom-up strategies. There's a whole range of new designers, and they are using the term urban tactiques and the support of user-generated urbanism. So my presentation today has two parts. One will tap into the understanding of public space as a cultural place, and the other one will also connect back to the events in the Middle East. Public space and the role of the agora. The concept of the public sphere as a place for citizens to perform political activism and debates as well as cultural life is essential for democratic governance. It already had a spatial materialization in ancient Greek cities and is still an essential part and component of contemporary cities. The Athenian agora, as a physical space of this concept, is an expression of this cultural code and a necessity for the democratic ideal. The double meaning of the terminology, describing the political assembly and the physical space simultaneously, stresses the importance of both the act and the place as an expression of democracy and an active society. The emergent rapid distribution and accessibility of the internet as a new virtual space to exchange ideas and to create communities seems to compete or possibly even replace the importance of physical realities. It includes physical spaces and interaction. The Arab Spring, however, also shows that its existence can be in support, specifically in societies ruled by autocratic governments in which freedom of press and opinion are not guaranteed. The presentation today is introducing, on the one hand side, the principle of spatial production described as social space, and secondly, will investigate the relationship between social networking tools and their effects within the public spaces during the Arab Spring. While public spaces, as described in this diagram by Danish urbanist Jan Gehl, nearly lost their function as places for necessary activities, the Arab Spring, however, proves how important this role is in times of political resistance. Before I dive deeper into the second aspect, I would like to introduce an expanded read and definition of public space and urban space in the construction of social interaction as stated in my dissertation, Staged Urbanism. The construction of public space as social space. Cities, and specifically public spaces in themselves, are one of the most complete materializations of social and cultural life. According to the theories, the French philosopher Lefebvre and German sociologist Löw, the terminology of this space has to be understood as a complex interactive construction. Social space unfolds in a material reality that has an effect on behavior and inhabitation. Consequently, material space is an expression of embedded cultural codes and hierarchies. As argued by German urbanist Feldkeller, successful public spaces are in need of criteria such as density, programmatic mix, and social relationships that identify territories of shared and common spaces, which support the initiation of a local urbanism. The production of space, or in the words of Silvia Molina, the espacio intermedio, is a permanent sedimentation of these conditions, a development that is inseparable from time and transformative processes. It creates a memory and an urban narrative that highly influences how spaces are identified and occupied. One of the earlier speakers today said that the city is reinvented every day, and this feeds very much into this statement. In the meantime, Löw argued already at the turn of the 21st century in her theory on spacing that the relationship between the physical space and the synthetic production of a mental space also exists within the immaterial space of the internet. Staged urbanism, urban space for art, culture, and consumption in the age of the event society, which are published 2009, articulates an expanded reading of urban space by interpreting built space, programmatic use, the spaces of organization, and communication through urban hardware, software, orgware, and brandware. The thesis was strengthened through the theories of German urban economist Dieter Lepple, who published in 1991 his essay on the matrix space. Lepple states that space not only consists of 3 multiple scales, but also of 4 layers: the physical materialization, the programmatic appropriation and activity, the organizational framework that defines the relationship between the first 2 layers, and finally the cultural representation system that, combined with the material substrate, allows identification and cognitive recognition. Since we are all familiar with the material component of space and its appropriation, I might get into the definition of orgware. Orgware is a summary of all regulations that are taking place in a specific site. It starts with the existing zoning code, and we already learned today about the limits, the regimes of limits, law, and property. It starts with the existing zoning code and ownership, but also feeds into behavior codes and the understanding of how networks are operating. Patterns of orgware always exist, even if we think it is unorganized. Orgware is more influential than we think. It is responsible for the physical materialization of space, but also regulates programmatic appropriation. Streets are zoned for cars. A simple shift in the organizational framework can trigger a new form of appropriation. Here, the initiative Pavement to Park, supported by the Planning Department of San Francisco, or New York City, rethinking the Broadway. Staged urbanism investigated an alternative set of design tools for the initiation of social interaction, incorporating place branding strategies, and I understand them as place moderation. It's about strengthening an identity that already exists but is invisible, through the choreography of hardware, software, orgware, and brandware strategies. At this point, I would like to introduce a design project from CCA Urban Lab that was incorporating all 4 spatial layers as an example in order to build a community and social interaction. Upspace, Open, Operable, and Occupiable was a project presented during the San Jose Biennial 2010, and that suggested a multi-layered scheme to reactivate empty storefronts in a neighborhood which showed 40% vacancy, a common issue in US American cities. The design started with rethinking how we organize a division between public and private and how we lease spaces. Instead of one renter for a year, we suggested multiple users that can rent for a time spot they really needed the space. Shared infrastructure, split costs, and the creation of a user community were meant to democratize a private space and to open this resource to the public. We interviewed the neighborhood, identified local needs, and designed a flexible architecture that could aggregate according to these needs. We also cooperated on site with agents that were representing the neighborhood and orchestrated a narrative with anchor programs that were meant to trigger occupation. In order to communicate this concept and to build a community, we used Twitter, Facebook, and blogs, where you could go online, reserve an hour, a day, or a week of the space. The prototype was presented successfully at the Biennial with programs ranging from fashion show, wine tasting, DJ launch, symposia, by kitchen, and art shows. Most exciting was the unexpected occupation, cheerleaders just coming in and performing for 20 minutes. Specifically, online orgware strategies utilized to initiate the social cooperation. Specifically, online orgware strategies utilized to initiate the social cooperation seemed a successful tool to redefine the appropriation of public spaces and to discover this new public territory. These concepts understand public spaces as a cultural stage, bringing with it the threat of instrumentalization of public spaces, as well as the opportunity to reinvent the void as a space for interaction, navigating top-down and bottom-up strategies. They are meant to be a tool for the community. Applications like New York City Arts are negotiating appropriation and guide us from a digital world into a physical reality. They support the idea of the cultural city, always understanding the city as a place for consumption, leisure, and exchange. Projects like the Phantom City are introducing us to a hidden world, a cultural place that existed in plans and utopian ideas, but never materialized and therefore exists only in a virtual reality. The application by Sheng and Snyder is designed for personal devices used while walking through the Phantom City, transforming the public space into a living museum. While we can understand these strategies as potential design tools to regenerate our public spaces, it is a given fact that urban spaces are produced on a daily basis through these 4 layers. As an expanded reading of staged urbanism, we can also interpret the events during the Arab Spring as a result of social networking tools that organized uprisings as a bottom-up process, breaking through the organizational frameworks of the existing empire. Public domains and the event of the Arab Spring. As discussed in literature, new social media are supporting the mobilization protest against autocratic regime. According to Knoyer and Demmelhuber, mobile phones and text messages supported the Orange Revolution in the Ukraine 2004 and 2005. The Saffron Revolution in Burma 2007 was mobilized by YouTube, and the Green Movement in Iran 2009 was supported by Twitter communication. The Arab Spring 2010, which is in its ongoing events, utilized mobile media, specifically the Web 2 communication, Facebook, Twitter, and web blogs. According to the Arab Social Media Report published by the Dubai School of Government, the protests had not simply been organized through social networking tools, but had actually led to a rise in the number of Facebook users in the region. While the numbers themselves do not illustrate the type of usage, the exponential growth in the number of Facebook users coinciding with the protests in each country does indicate a relationship between the usage of social networking tools, the political events, and evolving communities. Their research shows that during the civil movements in Egypt and Tunisia, between 88% and 94% of the associated information and news were firstly communicated originally through social media. According to the MIT technology report posted by John Pollock, also the activities on the street in the Middle East had been orchestrated and communicated via Web 2 media. Under the paradigm copy, publish, share, online tools had been used to build a community that then finally came together in the streets of Cairo, Alexandria, and Tunis. In the same report, it was stated that Tunisian virtual reality scientist Samir Garbaia looked at Facebook posts during the revolution. Using a script based on keywords related to ongoing protests, he measured how much time it took for posts to result in online responses and finally actions within the public street. The average was 4 days in November. The day after Bouazizi burned himself, comments were created within 8 hours. On January 1st, it accelerated to 2 hours. When Ben Ali left, it just took 3 minutes. These developments show the growth of online communities, the improvements of communication, and the importance of social networking media during the Arab Spring. Garbaia coined the term street book to refer back to the transfer of the interaction from social networks to manifestation in the real world on the street. The power of emergent digital public spaces. If you more deeply want to understand the power and potentials of digital media in regard to the production of social space during political uprisings, we need to differentiate 3 phases that are critical to the democratization process. According to Kneuer and Demmelhuber, there exists the phase in which the autocratic regime rules, the phase of protest and resistance, and finally the phase of democratic consolidation. In the first phase, as stated by the authors, new media technologies are open source tools and are therefore used from both sides. Activist movements to create democratic chat rooms and the ruling governments. The dominant opinion is that the digital technologies are therefore considered neutral tools to consolidate political activism and awareness. However, since most of the autocratic regimes are oppressing freedom of speech, these tools allow to found communities and to distribute opinions. The social space in this state is primarily online. We probably have also different standpoints on this, but there was also a communication showing that during the events on Tahrir, there were misguided messages sent into Facebook intentionally because they knew that they would be captured by the government, and there was a code system so that those who were participating in the demonstrations actually understood how to read these messages. In order to create a momentum of political uprising, the second phase deeply depends on high numbers of participants. The Web 2 tools allow to create a mass movement through user-generated content and many-to-many communications. Though the Arab Spring is coined as a Facebook revolution, official surveys show that Web 2 operated as a catalyst to generate a mass movement and participation, but the traditional media like Al Jazeera, we already learned about this, occupied important key roles. TV broadcasting used partly Facebook information as a source, and they had been during the uprising with 97% the most important source for information. The analog space and the production of social space within the physical world is necessary to state a visibility of the public that includes all citizens and shows that there is no intent to lose ground. According to Wolf, we find 5 functions of Web 2 tools: articulation, aggregation, mobilization, coordination, and dissemination. In this sense, technology is purely a tool. It can't provide content, but it can help to connect and therefore operates as a catalyst. In the last phase of democratization, the development of content seems to be the most critical. Can Web 2 media, as rightfully asked by Kneuer and Demmelhuber, help to shift from a moment of sole protest to an act of democratization that, as the Athenian Agora, makes space for critical political debate and participation? As much as democratic governments are more and more in support of e-governments to inform citizens and to enhance participation, mutation of these technologies might, but this is just a question, be a way to consolidate democratic content in the Middle East and to see the belief that involvement truly matters. As a recent event in Egypt show, the Middle East is still and will further need to balance powers towards a hopefully democratic society. Applications like Tahrir Square are trying to continue the support through Web 2 technologies. These tools might not establish parties and they don't articulate political programs, but they allow the general public to be a part of a think tank. They strengthen the political awareness and the importance of education and participation. I originally phrased some follow-up questions. The original thesis of this presentation questions if bottom-up net-based awkward tools have the potential to strengthen the production of public interaction, specifically in times of political uprisings. It seems proven that these media tools are not only appropriated for urban regeneration strategies, but also operated as a bottom-up catalyst, generating a critical mass during the Arab Spring. I prepared two questions that had been partly already answered in the keynote presentation. The first one was, public space is defined by its absolute guarantee, which might be an utopian idea, that to offer accessibility for everyone. The digital public domain is a general open source, but due to technology access, it is still a place for a limited user group. In the meantime, it has no spatial boundaries and operates therefore on a local, regional, national, and global scale simultaneously. What are the risks and advantages of the public space that is articulated as a public domain, and what is the relationship between the public and the analog and the digital? Because I truly believe that our society is moving towards a society that's heavily influenced by digital media, knowing that our kids have their friends on Facebook and not around the corner. And finally, considering that physical spaces have the larger capacity to create mental maps and to materialize cultural memories that live longer than a web blog, what would be their role in a civilization that more and more transitions to a digital sphere? Thank you.
Final speaker will be Dr. Wasma Osman, who is a visiting scholar at the head of the European Center for Near Eastern Studies and adjunct professor at New York University, where she defended her dissertation on television and the Afghan culture wars recently. Dr. Osman explores questions of visual representation and public spaces, also in documentary film form. She co-directed and starred in Postcards from Tora Bora recently as well. Her presentation today is titled New Media, Old Media, a comparative analysis of television and the internet in the social uprisings of Iran and Afghanistan.
I want to thank Monroe and Breyer for making this happen. And I also apologize, I don't have visuals, so you'll just have to look at me.
You want to take over?
Yeah, I'll take this off. Is the volume okay? Can everybody hear me? Okay. So I want to preface that my research is on Afghanistan, and I defended my dissertation last year. And it's called Thinking Outside the Box, Television and the Afghan Culture Wars. And it looks at the role of media in generating debate and contestation around a variety of identity signifiers, such as gender, expressions of sexuality, ethnicity. Afghanistan happens to be a very multi-ethnic country, although not necessarily multicultural. So looking at those contestations, as well as religion, you have the influence of Sunni Islam, Shiite Islam, Hinduism, and even Buddhism to a certain extent. And also looking at nation-building projects and the influence of that, such as democracy and modernity. The media proliferation that Afghanistan's currently experiencing is enabled by a new configuration of sources from transnational organizations, a lot of different countries, as well as international donor aid, and local political economies as well. So that includes a range of things from warlords funding different TV stations to more of a commercial private enterprise as well. But for this talk, I'm going to focus on the comparative analysis of television and the internet and the social uprisings of Iran and Afghanistan. And at the end, I'll briefly talk about public space and public protest in Afghanistan as well. Often at conferences and other venues, I'm asked, Why television? Why not study the avian film industry, the internet, or print-based medium? They all seem valuable media to study. I'm also frequently reminded that in the Iranian Green Movement and the Arab Spring, social media and the internet played a determining role in energizing and uniting the public into massive social movements. However, this is not the case in Afghanistan. Given high illiteracy rates and the relatively slow development of broadband and cable infrastructure, the promise of the digital age has only partially arrived in Afghanistan, and that's mostly amongst university students and some elites of society who can afford the higher speed internet. On the other hand, broadcast media of television and radio have grown exponentially and reached large segments of the population. So essentially, my talk is a little bit of a polemic because I'm constantly asked this question because it's constantly being compared with the Arab Spring and the Iranian Green Movement or Green Revolution. The fact that television is broadcast nationally and simultaneously viewed together within large household structures and relatively accessible and popular has made it a particularly important nationwide institution in Afghanistan, perhaps the medium that best provides a sense of Afghanistan as an imagined community, to reference Anderson, as well as a site of social contestation. No wonder then the hopes and fears about the future of Afghanistan from media executives to government officials, religious leaders, and international governmental and non-governmental consultants are being funneled into the media. In fact, some of the culture wars that I observed, such as the battles over censoring diverse expressions of gender and sexuality, including women's bodies, let's say from Iranian, not so much Iranian, but Indian dramatic serials or soap operas or Latin American ones happen only in the context of terrestrial television. This is due to the fact that the owners of terrestrial television stations, constrained by technology, are obliged to heed, to some degree, government regulations regarding what is acceptable to broadcast in order to maintain or secure a limited frequency wave. Paradoxically, pornography and pornographic imagery are readily available and accessible on satellite television. However, there's not many statistics, just as in the case of Iran, but less than 25% of the people, if that many, have access to satellite. Additionally, such content is also easily downloadable on cell phones, even in remote provinces, and available for sale in the form of cheap video discs behind the counter in every media kiosk in every shopping bazaar. With over 36 free new terrestrial television stations and counting, Afghanistan can boast that it offers viewers more choices for programming than many developing or even developed countries. After all, this is the basic formula of Habermas's theory of the public sphere. More free channels, in his case publications, equal more sources for the dissemination of information, which equals more competition for the creation of a marketplace of debate and ideas. Applying for a license and getting registration for a new broadcast television station that is not affiliated with the state is nearly impossible, on the other hand, in neighboring Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Iran, China, and Pakistan. And I also spent time in Tajikistan, and Pakistan, and India, so a good number of the surrounding countries. For example, in Tajikistan, there's only 5 television stations. They're all state-run or and broadcast, and they're all still very much under the purview of influence of Russia. Iran has 6 to 8 broadcast stations controlled by the IRIB, and everything in print in Iran, you have to get permission. So there's really nothing that radical or reformist there. So if the public sphere depends on freedom, and that depends on having an alternative to state-run television or state-run media, Afghanistan is certainly far ahead of its neighbors. Thus, the transformative, repressive, and/or repressive potential of different media changes dramatically across different sites of research and depends heavily on the socio-political realities of the region of study. Additionally, in complex, repressive, and/or rapidly shifting environments, the utility of media for reform and activism reflects media users and/or producers' ingenuity to evolve and merge traditional and new media in order to stay ahead of the learning curve. In fact, many of the television employees that I interviewed work across media platforms. When they produce a segment for a television program, depending on their message, they often repackage it for multiple other mediums as well. Even the Taliban have moved beyond using just their Sharia radio. They have recently tapped into mobile technologies and DVD production to disseminate and distribute their messages. In the case of Afghanistan, television, which has historically been deemed as a hegemonic media in the West, has proven to be counter-hegemonic in many ways. I get into this in detail, but it does a variety of functions, or serves a variety of functions, from exposing abuses of power and corruption of state and non-state actors, as well as critiquing international governments, and it fosters debates and dissent by airing diverse lifestyles, cultures, and televisual representations of gender and ethnicity and the other things I mentioned earlier. So I argue in my work or research that it's definitely generating a public sphere, and that a public sphere has emerged. Likewise, social media in Iran, which has been praised as counter-hegemonic force, has come under increasingly effective regimes of censorship, making people turn to mobile telephone technologies, which in turn have also come under a degree of surveillance, thereby leading people back to older media or smaller media, such as graffiti, video CDs, DVDs, and the like. Post-Green Movement, the besieged sanctioned by the state, have been targeting people who are quote-unquote being oppositional online. And the government slows down internet speeds to impossibly slow speeds during politically sensitive movements, especially the case in Tehran. Additionally, even during the Green Movement, there's debate as to how effective the digital media was. And as Breyer's IMP report on media consumption in Iran demonstrates, the revolutionary rhetoric ascribed to digital media in some cases was exaggerated, such as the use of Twitter by people. So a media deterministic approach or argument includes a holistic understanding of the socio-political realities and cultural developments in any site of study. The idea that technology, in of itself, by virtue of its creation, is solely responsible for leading us as a society to advance or regress is a technological or media deterministic argument. As a society, we bring our gender, sexuality, race, class biases, and preferences. No media is void of the imprints of culture, and therefore cannot claim to transform or save or destroy society. At best, it is a repackaging of the dominant codes that temporarily allow new players before market forces and media gatekeepers, through institutional mechanisms, subdue or entirely eliminate the transformative aspects of new technologies. This is exacerbated by the actual political economy disparities and structural imbalances that further alienate and marginalize the access of subaltern, disadvantaged, and minority groups. Today, not everyone has computers or access to them. The problem of access is further exacerbated by disparities in literature and education around the world. There is unequal access to advanced technologies within and among nations. Not so surprisingly, the digital age is following the same paradigm of conglomerations and consolidations as previous what's considered old media now, that was new media at the time. And the FCC gave away approximately $70 billion worth of digital spectrum to major media companies without much of a public debate in the US. Eric Kleinenberg argues that given these disparities, it is questionable whether the current time period can even be called a digital age, or that it's at least globally or universally a global digital age. The contrast between Iran and Afghanistan is one striking example of neighboring nations with completely different media infrastructures. Only 5% of the Afghan population are internet users, whereas in Iran there is over 50% penetration. So that concludes my, the bulk of my paper, but I also wanted to talk a little bit about the subject of this symposium, which is public space and public protest as it plays out in Afghanistan. Public space and public protest is also proving to be a powerful social force in Afghanistan. Since the central government of Afghanistan is relatively weak and spaces for public gatherings such as town squares, stadiums, and bazaars are plentiful, as well as very large boulevards in certain parts, in certain cities. Massive urban protests in urban areas across the country happen almost on a daily basis. During my fieldwork, I witnessed everything from riots over incidences of Quran burning, protests about civilian casualties, deaths of journalists, to student tuition hikes at Kabul University. Though vibrant and productive, this public space is also fraught and exclusionary. At the protests against what's called the Shiite marriage law, which is also otherwise called the rape law, I witnessed women getting attacked by radicalized youth from the massive Shiite protests that Iran has built and funded. Slowly, less women and girls attended these protests. And so in that sense, social media does become a more democratic and inclusionary sphere. For example, when the Afghan government and television owners refused to investigate or publicize the honor killings of numerous female television personalities, college students across the country demanded justice via Facebook fan pages dedicated to those specific on-screen personalities, as well as internet blogs, which offered them some degree of anonymity by using false IDs and pseudonyms. But of course, they have a limited reach because most people don't have access, so it doesn't really constitute a public sphere. Therefore, rather than turning to social media, when the government frequently bans popular television programs, and a good number of television programming on Afghan television is imported from abroad, or at least subsidized from abroad, even if it's locally produced, most people publicly protest for days or even weeks. Between the large outpouring of people at these protests and the subsequent broadcasting of the protests on television and radio news programs, in the majority of cases, these programs are reinstated to appease the public. Generally speaking, in order to prevent public protests from evolving into riots, which very frequently do during my stay there, there was, this is also called productive violence, but shops were destroyed and businesses were just destroyed. So in order to not let them evolve into riots, elites are often forced to address and calm public grievances that they take this form of publicness. Thus, the combined power of public space and broadcast media is a very effective social tool for collective action in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Those are the three talks for the panel, and I think there is an excellent potential for interposition of discussions about new media, including social media, discussion about the old media, including terrestrial television, and of course the oldest media of all, public space. We've heard how there are different organizing publicness vis-a-vis these spaces and these communication technologies, what Professor Al-Kafif called allwares, and perhaps it's a question of affordances of a specific media form for protest and democratization vis-a-vis the social and political realities of that particular country and that particular regime. So perhaps it's a question of how do we keep moving, how do these people keep moving online, offline, to try and find less colonized spaces for their own desires for public discussion. All the while, there's that question of how to translate that into enduring material public spaces. So with that, I'd like to open this up for questions. Yes.
Thank you. Mona, I'm going to direct my question to you. When you said that internet is not a physical space, it made me start thinking about, these Google glasses that are coming out, are already out on the runways, where you can wear glasses and it will, whatever you want, I guess, to see about the space that's in front of you. It identifies these things for you. So, I mean, that's where technology is headed. And technically, we already have it in our hands, in an iPhone or any other device. I guess my question is, I mean, I guess it's somewhat philosophical in a sense, but if you, in our desire to lay the internet onto physical space, or maybe it's putting us into the internet and creating it as a physical space for us to be within it. I mean, we also do that through our Facebook profiles or having some kind of avatar that makes us like alive in the internet. Do you think that this is like humanity's response to feeling like our public spaces have reached their capacity, we've used them as much as possible, or do you think it's losing sense of what they're actually made for because they're made to bring us together, and that technology almost makes us more individualistic because we're more focused on our own device than necessarily coming together and being productive through conversation and discourse and everything?
Very good question. I probably can't answer it, but I would like to comment on it. I think the Google glasses, I'm thinking you're referring back to tools like virtual reality. There's also this browser layer called Maya, and you can walk with your phone through the streets, and it's identifying all tags and links in the internet. So you're walking around the street, and you suddenly see the ranking on OpenTable, for example, for a restaurant. So these are tools to connect the physical space and the internet. What the effect on civilization is, I don't know, and will probably die before this is really finalized. But what I truly believe is that we live in an incredible paradigm shift of our civilization because of the invention of the internet. So, I mean, 10 years ago, I didn't even have an email address. And today, the only way of communication is not even emailing, but Facebooking all the time. So, and a whole generation growing up without knowing what a stamp is, because this is how we communicated in the past. So there's an incredible empowerment of internet tools. They're influencing. The fear is maybe that it is too disconnected from the physical space, that again, even social interactions happen in the Facebook realm rather than in the physical interaction, but there are also movements against it. And this comes back to understanding the limits and potential, because in the beginning I said I'm all about the potentials, but for sure we see that the internet is a highly controlled space. In the moment when the government says I'm shutting down the whole system, there is no communication. During the uprising in Tahrir, my sister is a journalist living in Cairo, and she said there was a moment where suddenly all telephone numbers had been changed. So they were requested to have a new telephone number, so the governments didn't want people to communicate. There's going to be a new struggle again, and there are hackers who are trying to fight these systems. So I don't know what the future is, but there's an incredible empowerment of the digital world. And what was the last final question was, I mean, your question was not really a question, it was just a philosophical statement. Yeah. So I can't answer it, but I think it's something that I'm really interested to observe in the future, and I very much see that it's a struggle that maybe historically happened in the physical space is now happening in the digital space without seeing who is actually communicating, while the physical space allows us to really see who my partner during the revolution is or during the uprising. And again, the real requirement of the public space, which is an ideal probably, that it is accessible for everyone. This is how public space is defined, otherwise it's private space or semi-private or whatever. And that only the physical space actually allows even persons who are not in the internet. I mean, think about all people who didn't grow up in the Facebook generation or don't have technology access. I mean, these are expensive devices, right? They need to have the possibility to participate.
I have a question for William. I was interested to see if you can explain about comparing the impact of Al Jazeera with Al Jazeera English and Al Jazeera, and how they function and how the link of the two, how does it work basically?
So that's a good question. I haven't systematically studied the differences. I've focused more on Al Jazeera English. Editorially, though, I've done research on the organization itself. So editorially, they function as two separate entities. So they have very different editorial guidelines. There is some sharing of resources, but there's also actually some interesting competition and tensions that happen between the two. So definitely Al Jazeera Arabic was more important for circulation within Egypt. This is what Egyptians were watching, one of the most important channels. But internationally, it was the story was with Al Jazeera English.
My question is partly related to how the policy of the two being linked to each other. Are they, because you said there was a competition between the two, which is interesting. Mm-hmm. So was it a kind of major, or let's say master policy behind the two, or they work separately because they have different audience?
Yeah, they function pretty independently of each other, actually.
Which is a bit strange, I believe.
It is, and actually they've been actually undertaking internal efforts to try to reintegrate them, because there's less efficiency. You know, there's a lot of costs to maintaining two completely functionally different organizations. But I've heard very interesting stories where, you know, like at the State Department, they'll say you get one audio feed for the whole network, and then the English people will plug it in, and then the Arabic side comes down, plugs it in, puts it in there. But there's also, you know, there's a long, complicated institutional history that goes back to the foundation of Al Jazeera English, and the fear that a lot of the journalists and the editors and the producers on the Arabic side they had a fear that Al Jazeera English was going to basically taint their brand, their product, which, you know, a lot of journalists paid with their lives and with their freedom, and, you know, to make Al Jazeera Arabic's branding what it was. And they were afraid that Al Jazeera English was going to come along and be this sort of watered down, friendly version. So, and then Al Jazeera English, of course, gets the brand new building. You know, Al Jazeera Arabic's kind of in it gets the older studio, the older equipment. So there's this sort of internal rivalry, but functionally they operate very independently at the editorial level. And so the way they tell these stories about the different uprisings from their countries, there's actually substantive differences, I believe.
Mr. Humans, you talked about using internet via satellite. I'm sorry.
Well, I can't move fast enough.
This is when new media and old media collide.
You talked about using internet via satellite in Egypt via Al Jazeera and reporting my laptop. So as you know, a huge company in here is providing the service, Beacon, I believe, is providing such a service, but it has a big challenge, security challenge, because of triangulation. In Iran, we have this kind of service and signal, but they can right away find the location of the people. Do you know that? How did they resolve this? Or just...
No, I don't know that they did. I know that the satellite users, you know, that's a huge security concern, and they usually do it, from what I understand, by moving around to try to evade them in a kind of cat and mouse game. But I don't know if there's any fixes to that. I don't fully know all the technical aspects, so I'm only hearing from like reporters who have been, you know, for example, and this actually, a lot of reporters during the Iraq War were very concerned about satellite uses, because both insurgents were using them and reporters, and sometimes the U.S.-led forces weren't always so careful in making that distinction between different types of users. So, from what I understand, in Syria, the concern still remains. In fact, I think the French reporters that were killed, I think that their satellite phones kind of tipped off their location. whether or not it was intended to get them or to get possible insurgents. So I don't know if it raises the question. I'm thinking maybe in a dense building with many different floors in a cluster, maybe it's hard to precise exactly where they are. I don't know why the Egyptians were able to find the beacon.
That's why people in Iran, they can just use a one-way internet,
Right.
via satellite, but not two ways.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Thank you.
There's another hand up.
Thanks. I had a question for Professor Osman, and I'm not certain if you can answer this question related specifically to language in Afghanistan. I mean, I know if you watch Persian language broadcasting like BBC Farsi, something along these lines, you'll have, I mean, there's a lot of coverage of Afghanistan and a lot of interviews of individuals who are speaking either in Dari or in Tajik, where there's a level of mutual intelligibility. And I'm interested, even though, as you mentioned, the satellite penetration is relatively low in Afghanistan, I'm assuming that that penetration is much higher at the elite level. And I'm wondering how this might be affecting Afghan, Dari, or Tajik speakers, and I'm wondering whether or not the influence of a satellite broadcast network with Persian is influencing the way in which elites in Afghanistan are communicating in Dari or in Tajik. Are they importing words? Are they changing any of their grammatical structures in a way that reflect the growing international presence of Iran or Iranian broadcasting, whether that comes from Iran itself or comes from the Voice of America or comes from the BBC? Thanks.
I guess I could just use this. That's a really great question, and I think, and I addressed this a little bit in my work, that Iran definitely has a big influence on Afghanistan, and not so much via satellite, because as I said, satellite is not that accessible there, but Iran funds, I would say, a number of the 33 broadcast stations while I was there, and Iran also has, I mean, as most of the people here explained, has a very prolific publishing industry, and technologically speaking. So if you go, let's say, to buy Microsoft Word, you're not going to find it in Dari. You're going to, in Kabul, you'll find it in Farsi, because after over 30 years of war, Afghanistan has fallen behind on many of those things. And so I think the dominance of Farsi and the Iranian money pouring into the media as well has definitely made Dari even more of an important language in Afghanistan as compared to Pashto and Uzbek and all the many other ones that are spoken there. Yeah, so.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question for Mona, or all of you, which is that, how do you think, and this is kind of in relation to the design project, which is of course, that you presented, which is of course of special interest to me as a designer, but how do you feel virtual space or digital media enhances the physical space experience? So if you're the physical public space, I know you talked about the way people could sign up for that piece that was sort of occupying the storefronts temporarily. Do you think that there's a level of interaction or enhancement that exists when digital media kind of combines with public space?
So in the off space, but this was just an example, there are a lot of other projects out in the world that are using weblogs and internet tools and applications, in order to communicate, this exists now and it is public to the public. And the way it's offering the possibility to participate. I want to give you an example where the huge airfield in Berlin, for example, the territory that is, while they are struggling to build the airport, the new one, the territory is given back to the neighborhood. And it's a huge area in the middle of the city, and there are all these moderation processes, how the neighborhood can participate in this. And digital media in this case allow us to communicate and to allow the possibility to inform themselves and to understand what the potentials are, what the programs are, or the slide that I showed from Bryant Park in New York. Everyone who's living in New York probably knows how hyperactive this space is. And it was initiated at the beginning as a bottom-up movement to organize how events can take place there. And when I talk about events, it's not necessarily the eventization of spaces. It is completely instrumentalized, and the only focus is to create an economy out of the space. But this is also about how can the sports school around the corner, the yoga class around the corner, bring in a program into the public space where everyone can participate, and it's even without entrance fee. So internet allows us to communicate that these things are happening, and allows us, in the OpSpace case it was to sign up, but it was because we needed to there needed to be a choreography for sure. But it's a tool for communication, mainly. You're living in New York and you have a different opinion on Bryant Park.
Sorry. Again, this question is for Mona. Philippe Morel, a French architect, actually wrote a thesis on living in the Ice Age, and he talks about computational and rationalism as part of this modern movement. And one question they aroused for about your presentation is companies like Google and Yahoo are buying large piece of land in the cities to build up these hubs for their telecommunication and their internet and interface, what are called stages. We're going to be fighting for space, for physical space at one point in time. Cities will have to expand for allow these kind of new cities of technology information to take place. How do you see as a designer the potentiality of us humans to be relating to that kind of spaces?
To which space? The space that Google is buying in the city, or?
Exactly, the technological space, the informational space versus the public space.
I'm not sure if I understand your question correctly, but maybe to comment on the Google empire. Well, it's super critical. I mean, corporate urbanism, where huge corporate firms are buying, it's private ground. It's highly protective. They don't want anybody to participate in this because these are technology secrets that are actually hidden from the public. But I'm not so sure if I'm really understanding your question, so maybe can you rephrase this?
So the physical space. So physical space is changing, right? So we are companies like Google are buying space that is close to high-speed links where they can put their servers connected to those high connectivity spaces. Those spaces tend to happen where waterfronts, spaces, harbor, main territorial spaces in cities. Like if you look at Philadelphia, Market Street is one of the highest speeds of internet connection because it's connected to the Delaware River, and this is a harbor for high speed. So if Google, spaces like companies like Google and Yahoo are buying these kinds of spaces, they have to be close to, in proximity to those high-speed cable lines or networks. Us humans, people who are inhabiting space, how can, as designers and cities will be phased out, be moved out for giving out these spaces? So I want to see, as a designer, you have an idea how these spaces can be kind of shared, not shared, but reorganized is what I'm trying to find out.
Yeah, maybe. So corporate firms like Google are becoming extremely strong parties in governing space, purely because of the economical power that stands behind it. And the question is, if there are cities, for example, if cities are able to create productive public-private partnerships. I know that in America this term has a very bad connotation, but urban renewal also has a very bad connotation, and coming from Europe, both terms actually have a positive connotation because it depends on how the corporate partner in this case is able to really produce a benefit for the city. So there might be text laws to come back to the organizational structures, how place and space is organized in the city, where cities create a stronger agency for their citizens and their population to say, well, you can come in and buy this land, but we have a tax system and we need you to invest into the public space. And we need you to invest into public, not only public space, but also into public programs. So it's a deal somehow that cities are making with corporate players. And it's extremely important that they have their foot in the door, because for sure this can also be very easily lost territory. I mean, I don't want to be too Eurocentric here, but the fact that American cities are highly privatized. I mean, there is hardly property that is still owned by the cities. And then on top, cities are not necessarily in high stance financially. This is causing a very huge problem for sure to create property and territory for the public. That is an issue because the land was, I mean, in this case, the land was sold before the city even existed or before governance existed. It had something to do with the colonization of America, for sure. But I mean, there are examples in Europe where cities still own huge parts of poverty. Vienna, for example, is one of the best examples how cities, starting in the Red Vienna, are able to support public housing that has not the bad connotation of public housing in America, but is actually shared among all demographic groups. And they are the largest landlords in European cities, and I think pretty much in the world maybe. And they are producing a very good policy to support the public. So it's a question of politics at the end, for sure. But as designers, to bring this back, a lot of, not only in my role as an academic educator, but also in my role as participating in competitions, etc., to rewrite the code of the organizational framework, to make a statement that the organizational framework is actually producing the social space at the end, and to show that a recoding of this framework could produce a different urbanism is a way for designers to make a statement, to create a manifest, and to show it to cities or developers or whatever what the potentials are.
This sort of links to the question of the topic of public space and global media, and it may be more for Will and Wajma, which is how Al Jazeera or BBC Persia wants to see itself as public space. So that would be one question. And the other one is how the US and Iran try to shape public media in Afghanistan or elsewhere. That is to say, are they competing in terms of their media assistance, in terms of their policy pressures, et cetera? How do they shape or compete to shape media as public space?
I can start with the second question, which is how the U.S. is shaping or attempting to influence Afghan media. And I would say the U.S. via USAID, which is their main donor arm, as well as Internews and Voice of America and some of those other organs, is one of the largest funders of this media proliferation in Afghanistan. The most popular and contentious television station in Afghanistan is called Tolo TV, and that one is very much so funded by the U.S. And of course, they deny that. They don't, but there's plenty of statistics, and there's been a lot of accounts of this in the New Yorker and Vanity Fair and other places. So they can't. I mean, it's a battle for, as they said, hearts and minds, starting with George Bush, but now it's very much so continued with Obama. He increased the budget for USAID, particularly to aid Afghanistan, incredible by a good amount more, and so this is continued. But I mean, I would say the effects of that are are complicated, but overall, my overall argument is that because it's created so much competition, that because there's the US that's funding it, and Iran, and India, and Turkey, you name it, like all these countries are funding different TV stations and the media, that overall the result is very positive because you have multiple outlets, and this is, as long as you're able to own a TV, and even if you don't, you can watch it in cafes, or most of the time people watch it in large extended families. You have so many different options to see things and see different types of cultures, on TV, and it's generating all kinds of debate and cultural contestations and social movements. So I went in a little, to be honest, a little skeptical of the U.S. motives, and there's a great promo on YouTube of Obama, and it's a USAID promo that's trying to get American media specialists to go to Afghanistan to set up these stations. And I was skeptical going in about this agenda, but that was one of my surprising findings. Is I was very impressed and pleased, and noticed that they're doing some incredible work, and that's not to say that there isn't a dark side to that. Of course there is. I mean, the people who often pay for this media explosion and media freedom are the journalists and the, as I said, women who are on screen are targeted for honor killings, but the TV owners are protected from that, and they don't take the burden of that responsibility. So there's definitely a dark side to this contestation, but overall I think surprisingly I conclude that this development model, which I've been very critical about from in the past, as most left arguments are, is somewhat successful in Afghanistan, and I worry that with the withdrawal of the U.S. military and international military in 2014, next year, that they're going to pull out this international donor aid and donor community as well, and it's a big concern for the future of media independence in Afghanistan.
Just to answer, could I have time to answer the first one? Okay, yeah, I stand between lunch and you guys, sorry. So I'll try to make this quick. Al Jazeera does not have a formalized public mandate by any means, but I would certainly say, at least more on the English side, which I studied, I can say that there's a public media ethos, and that actually gets carried out and manifested in a couple different kinds of projects. So one example of a very public media sort of project is what was called the Somalia Speaks program. So Al Jazeera worked with NGOs to basically generate SMS text messages within Somalia during the famine, and then broadcast the content of those SMS messages outside of the country, and then kind of recirculate them within. And so it was kind of playing this role of a public media infrastructure within Somalia, which lacks a public media infrastructure. So it sort of carried that out by proxy or by surrogate. But I would go to another extreme to show how it's conceptualizing itself as a sort of public media, and that's here in the United States. When Al Jazeera America, when they announced that they were buying current TV, some reports say that it's $500 million. I don't know if that's an accurate number, but it sounds cut out alike. When they launched Al Jazeera America, one of the executive for the Americas said that this would be a stimulus plan for U.S. international journalism. A stimulus plan, which is obviously a very public and governmental way to approach it. The idea is that, I think behind this is that this foreign subsidy for international journalism can help make Americans more attuned to international news. Of course, you can see there's interests at play at that. And I would also point to Al Jazeera's training programs, that, like BBC World Service, or BBC Media Action, now it's called, undertakes like professionalism training and that kind of thing. And Al Jazeera actually engages in that. So there's a big influence in sort of the BBC model of doing more than just reporting, but kind of advancing public journalism. So I think it's definitely trying to undertake that.